Welcome to the world of scale modeling with Mike Ashe, where techniques, tips, and creativity come alive with dozens of tutorials, projects, tape-up reviews, and picture references to help you build better scale models and enjoy our wonderful hobby. Welcome to episode 15 of Building and Detailing the Monogram Revell 148 scale B-25J. In this episode, I'm going to demonstrate my dry brushing technique, my sponge chipping technique, and how to use pencil pastel dust to replicate grime and soot. To replicate the appearance that paint has worn off the edges of parts, I use silver paint, and I apply the paint with a short, stiff, flat brush. When dry brushing, you want to remove almost all of the paint from the brush, which is why I was wiping it off on that pink card. Now what I'm doing is I'm dry brushing the edges with silver paint. The edges don't have to be completely covered with silver paint. What you want is just a subtle effect that makes it appear as though some of the covered paint has been worn off, exposing the aluminum and steel underneath. This is why they call it dry brushing. What you're doing is you're rubbing just tiny particles of the paint color onto the edges. What I'm doing here is I'm replenishing the paint in the top of the cap so that I can continue the dry brushing. Note how I'm manipulating the tip of the brush around the edge of the part. The inside of the Bombay doors has both raised and depressed surface detail. So what I'm going to do here is after I dry brush the edges, I'm going to run the brush across the surface so that some of the particles of paint will attach themselves to both the depressed and raised detail. Note the sweeping motion that I use across the entire surface, and I'm applying very, very light pressure so that just tiny particles attach themselves to the raised and depressed detail. Here, I'm working on the landing gear doors, and I'm going to speed the video up just a little bit to save some time. What I'm doing here is I'm putting just a tiny bit of that silver paint along the trailing edges of the metal trim tabs on both the ailerons and the elevators. After the silver paint dried, some of the parts needed to be flipped so the remaining inside areas could be dry brushed. Once all the dry brushing is complete and the paint is dry, we're ready to move on to the next phase of weathering. I'm going to show you how I use a small section of sponge and silver paint in order to replicate what we commonly refer to as chipping. But what it really is how the wind wears down the paint on the leading edges of some of the parts and on the surface of the fuselage. For the paint wear and chipping effect, I used a Scotch-Brite non-scratch scrubbing sponge that I cut into a small section and then at an angle. I like to use the sponge side, which is not really a sponge, it's more like a foam. You can get different effects by cutting the foam side of the sponge at different angles. Just like in dry brushing, you dip the tip of the foam into the paint, and then you want to remove most of the paint from the sponge, so that as you dab it along the edges that you want to create the chipping effect on, you get just tiny amounts of paint, but in different random patterns. Here, I'm replicating worn paint sections on the insides of the bomb bay doors. Note how I'm using a stippling effect as I touch the foam onto the surface of the model parts. I'm going to speed the video up just a little bit to save some time. What I recommend that you do is use different types of sponges and practice them on spare parts in order to see what types of effects and patterns you get. I think you'll find that this is a real easy way in order to replicate the effect of chipping, especially around engine cowlings and leading edges of wings and on the leading edges of the fuselage and along the fuselage sides. Here you can see the silver paint has been really toned down by a clear flat coat. The sponge technique really gives you a nice random effect and it looks pretty realistic. The other nice thing about the sponge technique is you get to hide flaws. The last step in my weathering effects is to use pencil pastel dust to replicate things like gunpowder stains, smoke stains, exhaust stains, soot, grime, and even grease. You can also use different colors of pencil pastel dust to fade decals. Here I've created a small pile of the dust by rubbing the pencil onto a piece of sandpaper. And then I use a flat, stiff brush to carefully apply small subtle amounts to the surface of the paint. This process only works on flat paint colors. Here I'm applying some staining to the inside of the cowling areas to replicate some soot from the engine. Note how I'm running the brush from the forward half of the cowling to the back part of the cowling. Once you've applied the pencil pastel dust to an area, don't touch it. Otherwise, your fingerprints will be on that surface. What you need to do is carefully apply the pencil pastel dust and then seal it with a clear flat coat. I'm going to speed the video up just a little bit. Note how I wiped the brush onto the tissue before I applied it to the surface of the painted parts. This limits the amount of dust that gets onto the parts. Note how the strokes of the brush are from the top of the Bombay door to the bottom of the Bombay door. Here, the strokes of the brush on landing gear doors are from the top of the landing gear doors to the bottom of the landing gear doors. So we have three layers of weathering. We have the dry brush layer, we have the layer associated with the sponge chipping technique, and then the third layer associated with pencil pastel dust. It's kind of hard to see the subtle effect of the pencil pastel dust inside the surface of the cowling, but it's there. The sections of sandpaper are taped to a piece of wood, and the wood, the pencil, and all of the brushes associated with a particular pencil pastel color are stored inside these small Tupperware containers. These parts are now ready for a clear flat coat. These parts have been given a clear flat coat to seal all of the weathering, the pencil pastel dust, and to change the shade of the finished paint. Note the random chipping effect on the outside of this Bombay door. And this one is even better. The random chipping effect that you can achieve on sponges is much better and much more realistic looking than you could ever achieve using a paintbrush. I used all of the same processes I've demonstrated on this video on the fuselage assembly. And then, once all the parts have been given a clear flat coat and sealed very well, then I give these parts that are going to get decals a clear gloss coat. The additive effect of the 3 different layers of subtle weathering really makes a big difference in the presentation of your model when all of the parts are put together. The general rule of thumb for weathering is less is better. If you overweather an aircraft, no self-respecting pilot is going to want to get in a plane that looks like it's about to fall apart. I hope this video has been helpful to you in your efforts at weathering aircraft. And stay tuned for episode 16, where I'm going to demonstrate my decaling technique. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a thumbs up. And when you get the chance, visit our website at www.mikeashy.com, where you're going to find dozens of free PDF downloads, including tutorials, picture references, model galleries, projects, and my 5 original scale modeling books. Thanks to Bensound and Videvo for the royalty-free music, and happy scale modeling!